When we look at sales, it's something that's incredibly important to entrepreneurs and incredibly important to all businesses. But it's not something that's commonly taught in an academic setting or at universities. It's seen as something more of a trade skill or something that you learn later or you try and hire other salespeople. But what we recognize as entrepreneurs is that we need to some extent be a jack of all trades, and that in the early days we are often going to be our best salesperson because we have the vision and the motivation and the own inspiration for the product. So we're going to talk about sales, and we're going to talk about how you do sales forecasting. So when we look at sales forecasting, it's fundamental that you have revenue numbers and revenue numbers that you can justify as you're developing your business model and your business plan. And so we're going to examine how you do that and what are some strategies for setting these goals. So sales forecasting is multi-staged and multi-purposed. It's the plan for the business of how much to sell, how much inventory to buy, how many people to hire. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're buying too much inventory and you have a warehouse or a room that's full of stock that is just money that's sitting idle that could have been used for marketing or other purposes. You don't want to hire people and have nothing for them to do, to pay them a salary to sit, if not a good use of your funding, nor of their time. We also want to have a sales forecast that is convincing for investors, that's convincing for lenders, that has future financial projections that are soundly justified. We also want to think about sales forecasting as a technique and a tool for improving our business, of forecasting where our revenue is going and how can we improve our profitability. The income statement is one of the central tools to understanding how to do forecasting. So financial statements often look at past data. What were our revenues and expenses and profits in the past? But what we want to do is look at them in a more of a pro forma or a future-oriented mindset. And to do that, we're going to talk a little bit about bottoms-up forecasting. What that means is that we want to think about, fundamentally, what can we accomplish with our resources, with capital, or with the amount of capital that we're seeking. What can we sell, given the marketing, given the considerations in play? What are the expenses to satisfy the level of sales that we've identified? What are the other selling and general and administrative costs, the FG&A cost associated with the amount of marketing that it's going to take to reach the sales targets that we have? And how much money do we need to accomplish that goal? So what we mean here by bottoms up is we're thinking about what we as the company can do with the resources and strategies that we have. The opposite of that is a top-down approach where you may look at a competitor and say that you want to do some percentage of what they do. Or you may look at an industry and you may want to do some percentage of what that industry does. When you look at competitors or when you look at industries, I find it's a little bit more of a fairy tale to say you want to do 1% or 5% or 50% of what somebody else does, because it's not really a rationale to how you're going to do that. So I'd encourage you to avoid things of that nature, but instead focus on your company and your concept and your resources and the resources that you're pursuing to do a bottoms-up forecast. When you do the forecast, we're looking at revenues, considering expenses and profits. Revenues, fundamentally, is a price per unit, time the number sold, be it subscriptions or services or products or advertising. How is it you're going to generate income for the company? With that, we also want to think about expenses, what's variable based on production or variable pending other activities versus what's fixed. We also want to think about one-time cost as well as recurring cost. For most investor presentations, you're going to see a table that may look something like this, where over a series of columns that may be years or in the early stages of the company, maybe months, what are the revenues? What are the major expense categories? What is the profit? What level of taxation are you going to be subject to? And that's going to vary a bit by state and by country. And what are the net margins resulting from that? When you think about margins, that's something that you can source oftentimes by thinking or evaluating competitors, doing some industry research, and thinking about what are the norms in your industry. If you have a first cut at your revenues and expenses and your profit margins are 20 or 30%, but the competitors are at 8%, you may be that good, or you probably just missed some of your expenses. So in that way, be sure that you understand what the norms are in the industry before you begin to convince yourself that you're going to have a profit margin that might be unrealistic. You also want to think about revenues in the context of what can you do on what calendar, on what time, and what's it going to take to deliver that. So in that way, again, margins are something that you begin to research and can begin to think about as you're evaluating and exploring your competitors in the industry. Revenues are something that you can gauge based on the market that you're trying to pursue, what you can sell, and how many of those you think you can sell. And then expenses are often tied to what's it going to take to deliver that. What's it going to take either in the fixed cost of salaries or in the variable cost of manufacturing or in some of the strategic cost of R&D and marketing. Discovery-driven planning is a good technique to think about this as well. A lot of companies will struggle when they think about what should the top-line sales be. We'd like it to be a large number, but for many of us, it feels like we're just kind of throwing a dart, that it's just a wild guess. When you start with discovery-driven planning, you begin with the income statement. You think about, what is my profit target a year from now or 2 years from now? Many of us may think about, well, I would like it to be high, but if I'm going to pursue this venture full time, I need some minimum. If I'm supporting my own salary, I need $50,000 a year or $100,000 a year or whatever that number may be for you. If there are 3 or 4 of us that need $50,000 per year, that might be, salaries aside from our expenses, $200,000 in profit that we would need to be able to afford our salaries. So think about, what are the profit goals that you have a year out or 2 years out? And salary is something that tends to be the threshold, the baseline of what you might want to consider. We also want to think about, what does that mean? If we see that we have a $100,000 profit goal, if there are 2 of us starting a company, and if we have a goal of $50,000 in profit, including our salary a year in year 1, and we see that the profit margins in our industry are approximately 20%, well, to achieve $100,000 in a 20% business means we have to have $500,000 in revenues in that year. So that's what we mean by discovery-driven planning. You start by thinking about the income. You recognize what are their average margins in the industry and what are the level of revenues associated with that. Now, if you can operate more efficiently, if you can achieve a 30 or 40% margin, your revenues can be a little lower. If you're not able to operate as efficiently, which is often the case because you have to spend a bit more on R&D or you have to spend a bit more in marketing because you don't have an established brand yet, you might need to generate more than $500,000 in revenue. So think about that as you're evaluating your plan. From there, you can begin to detail some of your assumptions and some of your expenses. So looking at the industry as just a starting point, you'll want to go through and itemize each of those expenses on your own as well. And this shares a little bit more math on how we arrived at that $500,000. And this also shares some research in different industries on average margins. And so you can find this type of data. On the far right-hand side, you can see net margins. You can also see different margins and percentages, profits as a percentage of sales, and other factors that may help you in really developing sound financials that you can justify. So once those initial profit and revenue goals are assessed, we can begin to flesh out the expenses. We can begin to think about, what's it going to take to deliver on the revenues that we forecasted. So in summary, when we think about sales forecast, we can look at a market and we can say it's a $100 million market. or a $1 billion market. And if we can just get 10%, won't we all be happy? But the problem with that is that 10% is completely random. Why not 1%? Why not 50%? Why not 7.39%? It's all a guess. So you don't just want to arbitrarily guess at a percentage of a market that you're pursuing. Instead, I'd encourage you to do a reverse income statement of thinking about what are your profit goals in year 1, 2, and 3. What are the average margins in your industry? What level of expenses are you going to incur to reach the revenues that you would need to achieve to reach the profit goals that you've targeted? So working through it in kind of this methodical pace is something that I would encourage that gives you a bit more of a realistic path and a realistic roadmap for how to forecast your sales and how you're going to grow the company.